a phone call from Paul Reisner, who was at that point chair of the philosophy department. It came in late April, early May, and I was beginning work on my dissertation in graduate school, and I was not actively on the job market, but he had heard about me as a student through some other, the Christian philosophy network's kind of small, and thought that I would be a good fit for a position that they had opened, and he called to see if I'd be interested in applying. And my first thought was, no, I have funding to keep working on my dissertation. I know nothing about Minnesota. I don't even know if I want to go back to Christian higher ed. But Jamie, my husband, said, it's not every day that a job calls you, so maybe you should look into it and see what God is doing, which I did. And then it all went really quickly. After I applied, they checked references. They had me fly up here for an interview, and it was finals week when I was interviewing for the job, and they offered me the job. And so Jamie and I were like, sure, why not? We'll give it 3 years. And now it has been 23 years. So I was hired as a faculty member in the philosophy department. Starting out, 5/7 of my load was teaching in the College of Arts and Sciences, and 2 credits was in CAPS, the Adult Degree Completion Program. I taught ethics courses there. And then pretty early on, I also started teaching CWC with Sam, and then Chris came on board as well. I am thankful that several of the members of my department had been at Bethel for their entire careers, and so they mentored me a lot in terms of putting me in pretty early leadership roles. So after my second year of Bethel, there was an attempt at a general education revision that failed, and I got put on the committee to deal with the ashes of that project and come up with what was next. And that was very daunting as a brand new philosophy major, 20-something female. But it was great. And so then I've had a lot of key leadership positions over the years. I've directed the honors program. I served 6 years on faculty senate, at which point you time out. And then I've been the head of the Committee of Academic Affairs, CAA, the chair of department chairs. I really liked calling myself the chair of chairs for a couple years. I've been department chair of both philosophy and hippos. And then 2 years ago, I took on a part-time role as Associate Dean for Academic Inclusive Excellence. So I've always been a faculty member. I'm still on a faculty contract, but half of my time is working with the Office of Inclusive Excellence now. It's amazing to kind of think back. So when I was hired, they assigned new faculty a faculty mentor. I don't think we still do that. I don't know. But my mentor was Stacy Hunter Hecht, who was a professor in the political science department. And Stacy was pivotal in helping me develop self-confidence and develop my voice. Stacy oozed self-confidence, and we were very opposite in that way. But I learned a lot about being a professional woman. I learned about navigating leadership as a woman in Christian circles, how to be a good teacher, how to be a good colleague, how to use one's voice properly in the sense of powerfully, effectively. So Stacy has been pivotal in my life. Also, I adopted a child, which Stacy had also done. So this is my personal life too, a great mentor and friend. Kathy Nevins was also a very early mentor to me in my time here, really in all areas of work, in teaching. a lot of good advice and mentoring came from Kathy, as well as service. And it's funny because I kind of think back to those years. I think the faculty wasn't as big then, or it hadn't gotten as big as it would get anyways. And there was kind of a core group of women that would do things together. Like we'd take Boundary Waters trips or go up to someone's cabin. And that culture has really been lost in a lot of ways, and I understand that, but there was this really tight network of women supporting women when I first started here, and that was a blessing. Marian Larson has maybe played the biggest role in my career as a mentor. My office was down the hall from hers, and if Marian was telling you the story, she would say, for years I thought Sarah was too nice to be friends with. But one day Marian was working on her MDiv, and she was reading Martin Buber and had a question, and someone told her that I had studied Martin Buber for my dissertation. So Marian came down the hall and said, hey, could you help me understand something in Buber? And then we met for coffee, and then an amazing friendship and writing partnership grew out of that. We published many articles together, wrote a book together. But through that too, Marian is an exceptional teacher. So I've learned a lot from her about teaching, a lot from her about leadership. She's 15 years older than me, so I've also watched her kids grow up ahead of my kids. So there's also kind of like Stacy, that personal life mentoring as well. I was thinking about, is it any more difficult to be a woman here than it is anywhere else? I'm not sure. So I would say yes. I do think there's some pressures on women in Christian settings that we aren't supposed to be leaders, professors, teachers, working mothers. But I think in the culture wars that we have today, those issues are maybe even getting stronger outside of Christian circles than they would have, or the Christian influence on the political realm. Because I think it's not any easier for Kamala Harris to be a woman in the world than it is for me. So, lots of ways that it's harder for me, I should say. Now I'm going on a tangent. But yeah, early on, I had students question my authority. There was once a student in a contemporary moral issues class wrote a paper about affirmative action in which he made the argument that he was not getting as good of an education as he could get if Bethel had hired a man for my position instead of me, because they hired me because I was a woman. And I showed the paper to my department, which was 6 male faculty members, and they were like, just blow it off, no big deal. Today, I would tell that young faculty member, all right, no, we're gonna go file a grievance, and it doesn't have to be like this, it can be an educational outcome, but we're not gonna just let that type of harassment stand, even if it is a faculty-student relationship. Until this year, Bethel did not have good maternity leave policies or paternity leave policies. When I had my first child, which was in 2005, the policy was 6 weeks paid leave. It was treated under disability leave pay. And I had to have a C-section, so I got 8 weeks instead of 6, but obviously that's not enough time. And that's not just a problem with Bethel, it's a problem at the national level with not having a required parental leave policy. But our adoption leave was 1 week, which was not even enough time for me to get to Ethiopia and back. And with international adoption, you don't have any control over when you're traveling. I'm very fortunate that we traveled in July when I wasn't teaching, but our plan was that when I came back, I would work and my husband would stay home for that first fall, but then there was an issue with him getting tenure in his school district. So I had to make a last minute change in July to not come back that fall so I could stay home. And Deb Harless, who was, I don't remember if she was the academic dean or the provost at that point of time. Deb Harless has been also a very influential person in my life, so we can come back to that if you want to. But she graciously made some arrangements that allowed me to still maintain my health insurance and do some projects at home, so I could be at home but still be employed and kind of piece it together. But for a long time at Bethel, maternity leave was what deal could you broker, and a lot of that depended upon what your department would agree to as well. So it has not been easy for women in that way. And then I think too, students just face different perceptions. Student perception of men versus women. Teachers are different. I would love to have somebody do a study on the degree to which female faculty get asked for extensions or not non-documented accommodations more so than male students, or the amount of times female students end up involved with students' personal issues outside of their academic life. Just even being called Mrs. Shady instead of, I would rather have someone call me Sarah than Mrs. Shady. But having an email that says, dear Dr. Yim and Mrs. Shady, and it's two professors and we're saying doctor to one and not the other. So there's that perception. I've been in meetings where men speak over women. I've been in meetings where men speak over executive level position female colleagues. And so there is still that dynamic. It's certainly not universal, but it's pervasive. I can understand a little bit about what it's like to be on the margins as a female here, as a woman here, but it's a whole other ballgame if you're a woman of color. I've known women of color who have left because of it's more often microaggressions, I think, than macroaggressions, although the macro blatant things do happen as well. But yes, the way, the kind of disrespect with which they're treated, the lack of time and attention given to their opinions and voices in equal measure to white women or men. Even the comments that are made about their clothing or their bodies that you wouldn't hear someone else make to me, or I've been in conversations with a friend who's an African-American woman who works here, and I can't imagine the things that people say to her being said to me. So in a lot of ways, when I talk to students about privilege, I always say it's not something that you feel guilty about or that you're ashamed about because it's unearned, right? Nobody chooses whatever category they're born into and the value that society is labeling to that category. But what matters is, do you have a growing awareness of it? And what are you doing to leverage your privilege to help others? So in a lot of ways, I would like to work myself out of a job in the Office of Inclusive Excellence. I almost didn't apply for the position because I wasn't sure that a white woman should apply for the position. But Ron Franklin, who's our Vice President of Inclusive Excellence, who is one of the people that hired me, I asked him that question, and he said, unless everybody owns the work, we'll never make change. It's interesting too now in that position because I have been here for so long and because I'm older than the VP of Inclusive Excellence. I feel like in a lot of places where I go, I'm an institutional historian. So people will want to know, how did that happen? Why was it done this way? Or they don't even know things that were done or weren't done. And I think I have more seniority here than anyone on the cabinet. And so there's a way in which I feel like I have more respect now when I speak into things, more because of longevity. So I feel like I don't feel the gender pushback as much in my role as I might have previously. But I'm trying to leverage that privilege to help women of color at Bethel and students of color at Bethel. It took 9 years to start a gender studies minor here. And that's a long story in and of itself. And I think that gender studies I should know how many years it's existed here. I feel like 10 at least. I don't know. We'll have to go back and look at that. But when I started teaching Intro to Gender Studies, students would get really fired up about women in leadership in the church kind of issues and the complementarian versus egalitarian debate. And now most students are kind of indifferent to that, or they don't see it as relevant anymore. Or what students now are really interested in more is the actual gender side. So understanding what it means to be trans or gender fluid or non-binary, and then how are Christians supposed to navigate those terms and those identities? So there's been a big shift, I think, in that, and thinking less about categories of men and women and more about the fluidity. Also, I think people are more, and students are more aware of the intersectional aspects. So like not just being a female, but the ways that race and socioeconomic status and age and different levels of ability and religion, that all of those things intersect to impact who we are in the world. So I think that conversation is a lot more common now as well. I think for better or for worse, I feel like it's the same. And I don't know, I think for better or for worse because it's not great across the board, right? I mean, I face the same problems in any aspect of my life, but then there's also some relief in that Bethel's not worse. So like somehow. So I remember when my first son was a baby, I didn't come on campus on Tuesdays. And I signed up for a women's Bible study. And I went to the very first one, and they had like a childcare where you could put your baby during the Bible study. And I was checking him into the childcare, and the woman there said, "Oh, it just warms my heart when I see, Christian women who aren't, in that lie of being a working mother." And I was just, I am a working mother, and maybe this Bible study's not for me. I didn't say that, but in my head I was like, So I think in the church, there's always still that tension of what can women do, what should women do. Even if we have women in leadership, there's still the idea that, like, if we're going to talk about sermons, when we do sermons on David or Paul or Jesus, right? It's not, this is our Men in the Bible series, and we're really going to target it to men for the men's retreat, right? No, it's just the Bible stories, right? But usually when we talk about women in the Bible, we have to label it. This is our Women in the Bible series, and maybe that Bible study is only for women, and maybe that's only for the women's retreat. So I think even as we've elevated the status of women in the church in a lot of ways in the Protestant or evangelical tradition, still the identity of women, generally speaking, is still secondary. It's still other. I have, in the last 4 months, become actively involved in local politics in my neighborhood. And oh my word, the way that I am treated as a woman at city council meetings, on social media, it's abhorrent. And so that makes me realize, oh, yeah, it's not just Christian circles. But I also think that's part of, like, I don't know that in 2014 it would have felt like that. I think it's in the culture war shift, the more conservative voices are more sexist than they used to be, or more openly critical of outspoken women. And so that's a shift. Also, I think politically, with states that are decreasing women's reproductive rights or other rights, there's just kind of this anti-female backlash, or anti-female independence backlash, anti-female voice backlash. And yeah, and I haven't experienced that as much, but I think it's becoming more prevalent. So what I do in that class is I don't overtly use Bethel as a case study, but when we're talking about different topics, I'll usually relate it back to Bethel. So if we're talking about, let me think of some examples. I do still talk about complementarianism and egalitarianism with them, and then I ask them, which category do you think Bethel fits in? And they'll think about women in leadership, and and especially when we had Laurel Bunker as our campus pastor, we're like, oh, we're egalitarian, and yes, but it's also not written into any of our core beliefs that we are. So that kind of surprises some of our students. I also talk about it when, actually on issues of gender and sexuality. There's a book that I use on that was actually edited by Jim Bilby and Paul Eddy. It's 4 Christian views on transgender identity. And I used it for the first time this fall thinking, okay, that'll be safe to use if it's edited by Bilby and Eddy, and like we've got 4 views, and I'm not telling them which one to pick. But in that book, one of the 4 views, one of the authors looks at case studies of George Fox University, Calvin University, and I believe Wheaton College is the 3rd one, in terms of a spectrum of views about gender and sexuality. So then I have students try to think about where would they place Bethel in that category. And I always ask them to also evaluate, what do they think? Do they like where Bethel is placed? Do they wish Bethel would move one way or the other direction? And it's kind of fascinating to me because I find students kind of 50-50 on those issues related to gender and sexuality right now. I always make sure we talk about sexual assault and sexual harassment in that class, just because there aren't a lot of places students have to talk about those issues on campus, and everybody does the video once a year, but we forget, or we are doing something else while we're watching the video, whatever. And so I think it's just always important for students to feel empowered, like they would know how to help a friend who is a victim or a survivor of assault or violence. And so we do it, and we always talk about Bethel's policies. So I work it into the class, but I try to avoid ever making it the theme of a theme. I would like to go back to say how much I appreciated working under Deb Harless as an academic leader, because not only was she like very wise and very good at her job, but she was so good at empathy for being a working woman. I remember after my first son was born, within that first year, she invited me to lunch in the DC, and she was just asking me how it's going. And I'll never forget her telling me this story of how she would dress her child in their clothes for the day the night before and let the child sleep in them and then get up to go to daycare, because the mornings were so chaotic. It was easier if the baby was already dressed and ready to go. And she just would always humanize herself in that way. And so I could talk to her as, you know, a leader, a supervisor, someone I report to, but she also always humanized herself. And so it's funny now as I get older and I know younger faculty having, you know, their first or second kids or navigating those early stages of life, I try to be as open and empathetic and humanizing of it as I can, because that meant so much to me. And it also, I think it empowered me to believe I could do this. Like I'd figure it out. And so helping women imagine how they're going to be able to, you know, whatever it is, that's something that I now feel I'm in a good position to be able to do. I hope that Bethel well, I'm going to actually quote Ron Franklin, but I hope that Bethel continues to reflect its name, Bethel, the house of God, where every tongue, tribe, nation, and gender, I will put in that list, worship is well together, and that it's a place where everyone is flourishing, and that we're seeing similar rates of flourishing regardless of what the delineating factor is. So similar rates of flourishing between male faculty and female faculty, between male students and female students, between students of color and white students, between Pell eligible low-income students and our wealthiest students, our students with neurodiversity, and you know, that we just keep getting better at navigating difference and finding community in the midst of that difference, because that's what sets us apart from the tornado that's going on in the United States right now, right? I mean, I think that's who God calls us to be, and that's actually how we're countercultural, and it's missional, but it's also the world, right, that we're living in, that there's not going to be a majority over 50% demographic within the next 15 years or so, and that's going to happen sooner in the under 25 category than it's going to happen sooner, because we have more racial ethnic diversity at the younger ages. So it's missional, but it's also just the world we're living in, and we need to learn how to navigate that well for God's glory and our neighbor's good.